Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. Welcome to the fourth episode of our sixth season of Diplomatic Immunity, looking at the geopolitical and economic fallout from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. From energy to technology, to intelligence, to geopolitical alignment, Russia's invasion marks a sea change in numerous areas of diplomacy and foreign policy. We'll be getting together with the best professionals in these fields to take stock and analyze where these trends may be headed.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Today, we're excited to discuss developments in Russia's sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and we're joined by Erica Marat. Dr. Erica Marat is a professor at the National Defense University and adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Her research focuses on violence, mobilization, and security institutions in Europe, Central Asia, India, and Mexico. Her book, Transformative Violence: When Routine Cruelty Sparks Historic Mobilization, will be published by the Oxford University Press in 2024. Let's listen to the conversation. Erica, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation as well. A lot going on here. So before we really get into sort of how the Russian sphere of influence has changed following the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we also have to fill folks in on what was the political situation in Central Asia and the Caucasus like. And in order to do that, we sort of have to go back to the Soviet Union, right? So can you kind of give us a little bit of a background here on what was going on in Central Asia and the Caucasus prior to the fall of the Soviet Union?
So, the decade before the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 was very tense for both regions because economic inequalities within the Soviet Union were becoming more and more obvious, that Moscow was the richest part of the empire, whereas Central Asia and South Caucasus, especially rural areas, were suffering from economic decline, lack of basic food and necessities for the population. And at the same time, more and more people became aware and ready to engage in conversations on what the Soviet Union really means, how it curtails their national identities, how oppressive it was during its formation in 1920s and 1930s. And when Gorbachev announced glasnost, so more openness within the Soviet Union, those grievances started coming out into the public, and more and more people, especially in urban areas, were ready to act on it. So there were protests in Kazakhstan in 1985. They're commonly referred to as Zhaltaksan, referencing the area in Almaty at the time, when the local population was against Soviet policy of removing ethnic Kazakh from ruling the Soviet Republic of Kazakhstan and replacing with a Russian candidate. So it was a bloody event. The Soviets squashed that mobilization. And then similar protests were taking place in Tbilisi in 1989, and we, of course, know in the Baltic states. And then at the same time, we saw nationalistic movements rising as well, especially in Armenia, when Armenian mobilization, bottom-up mobilization, led to the Armenian de facto takeover of Nagorno-Karabakh from Azerbaijan. It was a very tense period, but it wasn't just because of the glasnost. It was because of this built-up frustration with the Soviet regime. There was a sense that Soviet regime is crumbling, that it's not sustainable. At the same time, the time was filled with uncertainty. How long will this last, and how much will Moscow exert power, including military power, to retain Soviet regime? It was a very tense period.
Yeah, and after the Soviet Union fell in 1991, then what happens? You talked about you've already had sort of these nationalistic feelings boiling to the surface, and a lot of different changes were in the air. We have the creation of a number of new countries. So, what did happen after the Soviet Union fell, and what has Russia's relationship been like with these new nations since 1991?
Sure. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, 15 new countries emerged, or let's say 14 plus Russia. Central Asia was made of five countries: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and South Caucasus, three countries: Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia. And the 1990s were even more difficult for all of the former Soviet republics because obviously Soviet planned economy did not bring prosperity. It resulted in the total collapse of economies that now had to reorient themselves from planned economies managed from Moscow to market economies. And that was a period of lawlessness, economic decline, extreme poverty, disruption of basic services. So, growing up in Kyrgyzstan in the 90s, I remember that everything collapsed. There was no public transport, schools that just were severely short on teachers. Like one teacher would teach all the subjects. I would come home and there was no electricity or running water and no food. So parents lost jobs. So the public sector employees, which was the majority of employees in the Soviet Union, most of them lost jobs overnight. Savings were evaporated, basically, was a transition to market economy. And so it was a period. The 1990s was a period of confusion, both in Central Asia, South Caucasus, and in Russia. And at that time, Yeltsin, seeing this collapse and frankly humiliation for Russia that emerged after this Soviet empire as impoverished and politically unstable, unlike other empires, let's say Britain or France, that emerged after um, their imperial period, more wealthy and geopolitically influential. Russia was really in shatters, Russian economy and politics. And Yeltsin, the way he portrayed countries that were formerly occupied by the Soviet regime as those free riders that benefited from Soviet regime and that Russia needs to free itself from. And he declared independence for Russia, which makes very little sense, but he declared Independence Day for Russia. He was not interested in re-engaging with those countries and more interested in aligning with the West. That, of course, completely changed when Putin came to power. He quickly pronounced the destruction of disintegration of the Soviet regime as the greatest tragedy in the 20th century. And he tried to increase or reinstate Russian influence in both South Caucasus, Central Asia, but also, of course, Ukraine and Baltic states.
I know you're talking about President Yeltsin during the 90s, basically not really wanting to do anything to do with those former republics because, well, let's be honest, he's got his hands full with just the change to a market economy in Russia and everything that was going on in Russia. But I know a large part of what was going on was the U.S. and the West pumping money into Russia to try to make it stable, bring it into the Western sphere economically and politically, and all that kind of stuff. Was the U.S. doing any of that with these new republics or these newly independent nations, or was it just kind of also we're just so focused on Russia? I mean, I know they dealt with Ukraine to some extent because they had nuclear weapons and because of its size and things like that. But was it also kind of hands off in the 90s?
I think US played a really important role in recognizing all those former Soviet republics as independent states, US was one of the first, if not the first country in most of those countries to open embassies, so to declare their independence. There was a lot of aid coming in to Russia, of course, and up until the recent invasion of Ukraine, Russia continued to be the most important country in the eyes, I think, of Western policymakers to engage in this part of the world. But there was quite a bit of aid flowing into Central Asia and South Caucasus as well. Uh, and then, of course, under the Clinton administration, there was a huge push for NATO expansion eastwards. And that's when not only Eastern and Central Europe joined uh, NATO, but of course, the Baltic states that were formerly occupied by the Soviet Russia as well. I think United States, with various degrees of success, tried to build relations with all of the 15 countries that were formerly Soviet Union.
And then you said once Putin got in power, things changed, to put it lightly.
Yes, things changed. He openly tried to recreate the Soviet regime. He boosted the importance of security alliances and economic alliances with Central Asian and South Caucasus countries. He, very importantly, he saw democratic changes in countries like Ukraine, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan as a direct threat to Russia because he framed those changes as inspired by the West, whereas as funded by the West, kind of denying the agency of the very people who brought those changes. So the color revolutions in Georgia in 2003 and in Ukraine in 2004, when people demanded more transparent elections, more accountable governance, less corruption. And Putin saw it as a threat as to his influence in those countries. And since then, he openly criticized the West, and he presented it as if the West is encroaching on territories where Russia is entitled to exercise unlimited imperial control. And bit by bit, he was able to be successful in reimposing Russia's influence. It started with criticizing color revolutions and then occupying 20% of Georgia's territory, and then invading Ukraine in 2014. In all of those cases, he was able to get away with maybe some international sanctions, but no direct confrontation with the West.
Yeah, and a good example of that, as far as the role Russia was trying to play and the influence it had on some of these countries, I think, is just before the invasion of Ukraine, we saw Russian troops go into Kazakhstan. Can you walk us through that episode? What was that about? How did Russia respond, and was it successful or not? And I think this is it's a really key example. I think because it was what like literally the same month but just before Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022.
Right. So let me start from the beginning. In January 2022, Kazakhstan was submerged in this nationwide. So it's a large country. It's one of the largest countries in the world, but it was submerged in nationwide protests that demanded different things, but they were a result of decades of corrupt and authoritarian governance in Kazakhstan that brought, of course, economic development, but it was unequal. It continues to be an unequal economic development. This oil-rich, resource-rich country, sparsely populated, but many parts of the large groups of population still suffer from incredible poverty. And those mass demonstrations were then used, seems like, by various political factions loyal to the previous president regime, Nursultan Nazarbayev and his successor and current president, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. And it seems like they were inter-elite struggles, and Tokayev was not able to fully exercise control over the monopoly of use of violence, so over police forces and armed forces. So he called on collective security treaty organization that has been dormant when Tokayev needed external support. Putin and other CSTO members, including Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, Belarus, sent their battalions to Kazakhstan to show their support. They didn't really actively deal with protesters or any other political actors, but they demonstrated their support of Tokayev's regime. And that was a success for Putin. I think he saw it as a way of controlling Kazakhstan, boosting the importance of CSTO in the region. And it seemed like he was able to secure unconditional loyalty from Tokayev going forward. And Kazakhstan is a very important country for Russia because it's they both countries share the second longest border between their countries. After U.S. and Canada, the Kazakh-Russian border is the second largest in the world. So they're very important. There are lots of economic ties, cultural ties, political ties. So he thought that he secured the support of his neighbor. And he was wrong. Later, Tokayev showed opposition to Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I guess that's our next conversation. How is Russia's role changing after February 2022 in both regions?
Yeah, and I think to start off, I think when we look at Russia's influence and sway in these countries and how it might have changed since the invasion of Ukraine, if you could sort of walk us through it in like two different ways, sort of like what is the 30,000 foot broad change that's taken place, if there is one, if you think there is one, in the level of influence it has in these countries. And then if you could sort of walk us through a specific example of how things are different now when things happen on the ground and how that's changed Russia's role. And you've mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh a couple times, and maybe we can use that as an example of changing Russian influence on the ground in a lot of these places.
So yes, there are big changes and there are small changes. The big change is, I think, among the people in both South Caucasus and Central Asia. The sentiments that Russia was not this benevolent, friendly neighbor existed for a while. But in countries like Armenia, Azerbaijan, and most of Central Asia, that you tend to have the population that is still nostalgic about the Soviet regime and continue to be fascinated by the great Russian culture. I think more and more people started questioning this narrative of, again, the great Russian culture and the great Soviet empire. More and more people started seeing Russia as an aggressor who engages in genocidal violence in order to install its quote unquote great culture. And that the way Russia is killing people, destroying infrastructure, erasing culture in Ukraine, that's how the Soviet Union was created 100 years ago. And more people are ready to engage in what is it that they lost as a result of Soviet colonialism, that we lost our cultural and political elites to Stalin purges, that large groups of population were starved, and Kazakhstan especially is now widely discussing their experience with starvation that killed approximately 40% of nomadic population in early 30s. We start asking about our tribal and familial memories that were lost after the Soviet Union was created and we were all Russified, and our languages were standardized or erased. And these kind of difficult conversations are taking place more and more widely. They were already in place in countries like Georgia, that was more Western oriented, more free. But in other parts of South Caucasus and Central Asia, those conversations tended to be more among narrow academic groups, activist community, or arts activists who sensed those issues, who researched and brought those issues to the public. So, and after the full-scale invasion, those discussions became mainstream. That Russia is actually an empire that continues to feel entitled to imposing its culture and politics on its neighbors. Conversations happening in Central Asia, for instance, especially in more politically free Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, are about the language, and especially among Russified Central Asians, Kazakhs, and Kyrgyz. Why is it that we speak Russian better than our own indigenous languages? And as one of my good friends, historian, and really this amazing scholar of decolonial politics and of Soviet history, Batakos Kasimbekova, what she says is that we were not Russified because we were never really Russian, although we know Russian language amazingly and everything about Russian culture, all the authors, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Pushkin, name it. We were never Russian. We were never seen as Russian by Moscow. What actually happened was not Russification, but our erasure of our indigenous identities. And what is it that we lost? How do we recreate? How do we find ourselves now that we see for what it was, the Soviet regime? So these difficult conversations are taking place all over Central Asia. And this is the biggest change, I think, that took place after the full-scale invasion and after we could all see the level of brutality in Ukraine.
That's interesting. The what your friend, the historian's talking about with the erasure of history, of your own history and culture and things like that, and the argument that the language, you're not Russian, you're just speaking the language and learning things about Russia. And I think that's interesting because on the flip side, in a lot of places like Ukraine, for instance, and a lot of the Baltic states are fearful of Russian invasion because of the fact that there's a large number of Russian speaking people, and that Putin has used that as a justification, saying these are Russians and we are, going to reunify them with Russia.
Yeah, so those justifications, they seem to be effective for the Western public or even the global South, that Russia is somehow protecting ethnic Russians. So not necessarily Russified, but ethnic Russian population. And maybe in Ukraine, the Russified Ukrainians as well. But it's not that. For Putin, he is recreating the Soviet regime. He sees himself as the global player. And again, what my friend Kasimbekova says is Russia portrays itself as the victim of the West, that the West expanded into Eastern Europe, into the Baltic states, and therefore being the victim, seeing the world and zero sum as a zero sum game. Putin is entitled, and Russians are entitled to victimize, so be aggressive against the Western encroachment on their interests. They see imposition of Russian culture, Russian language as a gift of civilization, as a way of helping backwards people like myself from Central Asia, from our own predicament of being backwards. And right, if we reject Russianness, and that's what Ukraine is doing now, if we reject Russianness, that's an attack on Russia. That's Putin's rhetoric. Now, the question is, do Russians also believe in that? And we, from my interactions with Russians in Russia, Russians in Central Asia, the sentiment is still very powerful among regular people. It's also very powerful among Russified Central Asians. that Russia is entitled to impose its great culture to save indigenous people from their backwardness. And that it's a very powerful imperial narrative that European imperial powers also perpetrated, UK and so Britain and France, for instance. But because they're democratic, those imperial narratives were deconstructed by academics, by politicians, by activists. Russia was never really democratic. Oh, maybe for a brief period after Yeltsin, but the 1990s, as we discussed, were so difficult for so many people. It was really hard to maintain deep conversations reflecting on what the Soviet regime actually meant, not only for countries that it occupied, but also for Russians themselves. So Russia never had those conversations. Russian public, I think, is very susceptible to this imperial identity still and the totalitarian state that they live now. And Putin is successfully leveraging this identity in Russia and beyond.
So we've talked about the broader change that's taken place since the invasion of Ukraine, but looking at some specific things that happened, can you talk to us a little bit more about the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and sort of what was the conflict about, and then what have we seen over the past 2 years, and what role has Russia played, if any, and how has that been different than what it might have done, prior to February 2022?
So the first war, when Azerbaijan retook some of the territories of Nagorno-Karabakh that were controlled by Armenia, and then some, was took place in the fall, so September, October, a bit of November 2020, when the US was really busy with elections. Europe was really busy with the pandemic, and that's when Azerbaijan decided to also retake those territories. And that, the history of Nagorno-Karabakh is really complicated as well. How Nagorno-Karabakh was placed, what was decided under Stalin, how Nagorno-Karabakh is controlled. It's a history that is so intensely debated between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We can have a whole podcast just on that. But nevertheless, so when Armenia is a historic ally of Russia, sees Russia as a savior, at least until recently, as the only country that would be able to protect Armenia from Azerbaijan. That turned out to be not true. It looks like that Azerbaijan and Russia collaborated in the peace agreement or ceasefire agreement that took place, though there's actually no peace agreement, in ending the war and ending military actions. In the fall of 2020, looks like Russia and Azerbaijan collaborated, and leaving out Armenia. Turkey participated as well. And since then, Armenia became more and more disappointed with Russia because of how Russia fails to support Armenia. And Armenia is becoming more and more pro-Western. In the past few months, Armenia is holding more military drills with United States, and seeing that Russia will not actually protect its rights just because of, let's say, common Christian identity, or just because Armenia was such a loyal partner in Russia's economic and security alliances since the Soviet Union's collapse, that Russia will be pursuing its own imperial interests. And yeah, Armenia is shifting more towards the West, and Azerbaijan continues to try to maintain a multi vector foreign policy with Russia, was the West, now increasingly with China as well. Azerbaijan also benefited from this idea of supplying Europe with oil and gas after Russia's full scale invasion. But Azerbaijan is an authoritarian country, so it's very hard to really gauge what are Azerbaijan's long term foreign policy goals, whereas Armenia now is really in deep soul searching about its political alliances.
So since the war, I feel like we've also seen, these reports out there and articles and analysis about, what we've been talking about, like Russia's loss of influence to some degree in these regions. Has there been anybody stepping up to try to fill that void? These countries are, some of them border with China and are near China. Has China tried to step into this void? Has the U.S. Upped its presence or what it's trying to do in these countries to sort of does the U.S. and China or anybody else for that matter sort of see an opportunity here to uh, gain new allies, leverage, whatever word you want to use in this region?
Yes, absolutely. Let's start with China. China's influence, political and economic influence, has been growing in both regions despite Russia. It started with economic influence. It looks like it's now shifting to political influence as well. And it continues to grow now that countries like Georgia and Azerbaijan are interested in participating in China's middle corridor, meaning the corridor that bypasses Russia and connects China to Europe via Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan. So the Kazakhstan, Caspian Sea, Azerbaijan, and then Georgia. Georgia is really fully on board the current government and building ties with China in that sense. Yes, Chinese economic and political influence continues to grow in both regions, especially in Central Asia. Both the United States and EU have increased their the level of engagement with both regions. There was this famous C5+1 forum between President Biden and all five Central Asian presidents during the UN GA meeting this September. Secretary Blinken traveled to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and there were other high level visits to Central Asia. Georgia is, of course, granted a candidate status to join EU. Looks like Armenia has more and more interest as well in perhaps in the future joining EU as well. But there's obviously an interest from the various actors and for various reasons. I think for United States, it's important to engage with Central Asian countries in order to balance the increasing influence of China. And for Central Asian countries and for South Caucasus countries as well, it is a really good position to be in. Just like other countries in the world, these countries, they want to have multiple external actors interested in collaborating with them so they can pick and choose and leverage those actors against each other. So that's the reason why I think, unfortunately, Central Asian countries, the ruling regimes in Central Asia, will continue to engage with Russia as a way of counterbalancing and attracting other actors as well, like China and United States. Just for those reasons, they might be disagreeing with the way Russia is conducting war in Ukraine, but they will still engage with Russia in order, again, to maintain their multi-vector foreign policy. And for Georgia, it is important to have increased Chinese presence and investments in infrastructure, including in deep sea port and in highways in Georgia connecting the middle corridor countries, in order to prevent further invasion by Russia. And so, hoping that Xi, just like he did with Kazakhstan this fall when he came to Astana, the capital, and said that China will protect Kazakhstan's territorial integrity, without, of course, naming names, but territorial integrity, kind of hinting that China will be against Russia's invasion of Kazakhstan. I think countries like Georgia are hoping for the same type of commitment from China as well, and going forward, not only from EU but also from China.
You mentioned the China to Europe connection and how it goes through Central Asia and the South Caucasus. Reminds me of this ancient road that they used to talk about. But there's, the new version of that ancient road, Belt and Road Initiative, that of China. You mentioned the infrastructure and the financing and stuff in Central Asia. I've also read a lot within the last year or so about the the BRI might not be living up to expectations, and that there's been a lot of negative things around it, that they're not really doing what they're saying they're going to do in places like the Caucasus and South Asia or Central Asia, and that they've actually stepped back funding as much in infrastructure projects and things like that. Can you speak to that a little bit on what you see in Central Asia, at least with the BRI? Does it seem to be successful to some extent, and do they seem to be funding it as much as they were in the past, that they being the Chinese?
So, in that sense, Central Asian countries are not as exceptional as, let's say, African countries, so Latin American countries. There is obviously an interest in Chinese money for great infrastructural projects that require huge capacity to really build. So the aging infrastructure, so roads and railroads from the imperial past, they're not replaced. Same goes to Africa, right? There needs to be a huge inflow of investment in order to build new infrastructure projects. And there is obviously an interest in Central Asia. The problem, I think, that Central Asia faces, just like with other countries in the world, is institutional capacity, that quite a bit of money is squandered, or the way contracts are negotiated are not transparent because, again, of the way the governments are set up in Central Asia. And they're just not able to handle this huge inflow of money from another autocratic country. That another country that is not transparent and is ready to, frankly, and there are reported cases, bribe officials in order to sign deals. And as a result, countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, they have huge debts to China without much to show to the population. There are, of course, important roads connecting various parts of countries, but they are really, there's the amount of debt that those countries accumulated potentially can be a national security threat. Kazakhstan is a little more skilled in dealing with large investments because it's a wealthy economy in general, and they're able to leverage China's influence much better. But even there is unequal distribution of resources, lack of transparency, corruption, and so on. Uzbekistan is trying to follow the path of Kazakhstan. Let's see what happens. But there is obviously an interest in Chinese investments, but because of lack of transparency, because of corruptibility of local officials, and desire from China to increase its economic influence without engaging in what many see state building that World Bank and or IMF do when they invest in infrastructural projects without conditionality. That creates problems down the road, of course.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that update. I appreciate that. But Erica Marat, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a really interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you again to Erica for her time and thoughts. This brings our regular Diplomatic Community episodes to a close for the year. And we want to thank our listeners for sticking with us throughout the season. Stay tuned for a bonus episode next week as we celebrate World Basketball Day, the first time any sport has received that honor from the United Nations, with a discussion on sports diplomacy with Lindsay Krasnov. This episode was produced by Jarrett Dang and Freddie Mallinson. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GUDiplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.